Hello, thank you for joining me. Thank you for having me here in Greece. My apologies for my Greek. The only Greek I know is my company name. And sadly, I'll be presenting to you today in English, but hopefully it will work out okay for everyone. My 15 minutes to spend with you, I'm going to try to focus a little bit on what we've been learning about ransomware. And of course, ransomware is a very, very big topic, and it's not necessarily a new thing. And I'm going to try to share as much information as I can in the time we have here. And then, if you're interested in learning more, we're also having a workshop with NSS later this afternoon, so you can sign up to come to our workshop, and we're going to spend additional hour or more talking more in depth technically about ransomware as well. Now, I don't know how to change slides here. Let's see if I can figure this out. Oh wait, there's a scroll bar on the side.
It's not touch.
Oh, it's not touch.
The right button.
All right, let's see, the right. Oops, but I'm now partly between things. How do I don't see how to scroll part way. Anyhow, my role at Sophos is to do research and to share that information on research with folks like yourselves. I work in Vancouver, Canada, and I've been spending a lot of time on ransomware for the last, I would say, even 5 years or so. I have no idea how to fix that, so I'm just going to ignore it. Anyway, so I spend a lot of time on ransomware, and a big part of my job is I work for the CTO's office just doing research. I'm not really tied to product stuff. I'm not really going to talk about products much. I'm just going to talk about what we learned about ransomware. And initially, of course, this is happening everywhere in the world, and we see it here in Greece the same as we see it everywhere we go. And initially, of course, it did start out primarily targeting Americans and Russians, actually, depending on the type of ransomware we're talking about. But the ones that we're really concerned with today are these cryptographic ones, the ones that are locking up everyone's files and making them inaccessible unless you pay the approximately $500 US, 400 euro ransom to unlock your files. And starting with kind of how it's happening, oh, thank you for fixing, the initial method of infection that really starts everything off, and probably in my experience, about 2/3 of the cases is it is starting with email. Now, I've got a couple screenshots of example messages that have been being sent to users that are leading to infection. You can see this one here, PostNL, and the one here in the lower right is actually the Royal Mail in the UK. Pretty much every postal agency in the world has been one of the primary ways of tricking people into installing ransomware and cryptographic ransomware on their computers. So with Hellenic Post, we see the same thing as I saw in Posta Slovenia when I was there yesterday in Ljubljana. Every postal agency, for whatever reason, seems to be a really good lure into tricking users to open some sort of an attachment. Now, looking at defending your networks, it can be difficult, of course, to filter and block attachments. Obviously, almost everyone has an anti-spam product of some sort, and that anti-spam usually has an antiviral component. But clearly, we're not blocking all of those messages, right? They are getting through to the user. One method you can take a look at for a defense against the emails, in addition to just having anti-spam product, many of them have JavaScript attachments. So there are two types of attachments they'll have, typically, up until the most recent ransomware, is either JavaScript or some sort of an Office document that has a macro embedded in it. It's really hard to deal, of course, with the Office document because none of us can say, no one can send us Microsoft Word documents anymore. I mean, it's an essential part of our business communications. But JavaScript attachments realistically shouldn't ever come in, and many of these, in fact, most of the ransomware email lures are actually JavaScript text files that are attached. So you may want to look into whatever email product you're using and see if you have the ability to filter those JavaScript attachments, or even use things like a DLP function in your email filter that can look for those JavaScript tags inside of an attachment and block those messages from getting through to users. Other common tactics we're seeing being used, this one here in the middle says Office of State Revenue. That one's targeting Australians in Queensland, state of Queensland in Australia. But we again see that in almost every country around tax time. a message from the local tax authority saying there's been a problem processing your taxes. Please open the attachment. The standard social lures that are being used. But the difference in these, and the reason they're so much more successful than they were maybe 5 years ago, is they've been translated into your language accurately, and there's not spelling mistakes. They're not sending messages in English to users in Greece. They're sending them in Greek. And they're having someone who speaks Greek write the messages so that the grammar is proper, the spelling is proper. It's much more difficult for users to detect that these messages are fake than it used to be, because the criminals are making so much money, they can afford to pay professionals to help them craft their message. And that's increasing the number of victims that open these types of messages. Now, the other primary infection method is through exploits. There's a very popular exploit kit that criminals resell called Angler. Angler represents about 70% of the infected web pages on the internet any given day. And Angler primarily distributes crypto ransomware as the payload to the victims. And currently, I've got a lot of logos here. Obviously, we see exploits against all sorts of different things, but I wanted to point out a couple in particular that seem to present the highest risk for getting infected. Currently, almost everything is targeting Flash. Adobe Flash is, without question, probably over 90% of the attacks we see on infected web pages that install ransomware. So if you can eliminate Flash or make sure it's patched, you'll go a long way toward preventing additional infections. It's really hard. People think it's really hard to get rid of Flash, but I use Java as an example that maybe we're just too pessimistic. A year ago, I was speaking the same way about Java, and everyone said, oh, we could never get rid of Java from our environment. Now, 1 year later, Oracle doesn't even support Java in a browser, and yet we're okay now. And I think we're going to see, a year from now, we'll feel the same way about Flash. You don't need Flash to play videos. You don't need Flash to do much of anything on the internet today other than play Words with Friends on Facebook. So if you can eliminate that from your environment, you go a long way toward protecting yourself. But I put a couple of these other ones here because many of us have applications that are legacy in our environments that we're not fixing. I see lots of standard company deployments of Windows 7 going out that still have things like WinZip installed because we always had WinZip, but they're not patching WinZip. And so I think it's a good practice, aside from saying patch all the time, that as part of your review of your policies and your procedures in your organization, that kind of on a 6-month basis, you should be going, what is installed across our desktops in our environment, and what can we get rid of? Because we are moving to a world that's more cloud-based and more standards-based. And we need less and less of these plugins and tools and all these different things, right? Most of our work these days is being done through a web browser, through email, and often through mobile. And we can get rid of a lot of these risky things that just were a necessity 5 to 10 years ago when we started creating our policies, but we haven't updated ourselves to 2016 yet. So some examples of things. CryptoWall represents the largest of these crypto ransomware threats. There's, in my estimation, in my research, I would say there's about 7 different criminal groups distributing crypto ransomware. CryptoWall is probably 70 to 80% of the ones that we see infecting computers. So the other 20% is competing other criminal groups doing the same thing, copycats, if you will. Up until a few weeks ago, when a new one you may have heard of called Locky has been hitting victims as well. So right now, CryptoWall and Locky are the 2 main targets that are harming you, but there are others as well. So I just wanted to show kind of how the tactics keep changing. The idea, of course, of the crypto stuff is to lock up files that are important to you. And the early versions we saw a year or 2 ago would have a list of extensions that they would infect, or they would encrypt. They would go, oh, what is going to be special to a home user? Probably their videos, their photographs, this type of thing. So they encrypted those. And then they said, well, what's important to a business? PPTX, DocX, AutoCAD, these types of things, right? Because they want content that you're creating is what they're holding hostage for the money. And so they looked at it that way. And they constantly were adjusting what they would encrypt. Now they've kind of turned it around the other way, and they went, well, what if we just encrypt everything except for things that are necessary for the computer to operate? And that's exactly what the most recent version of CryptoWall does. This version of CryptoWall came out in November of 2015. It's largely the same today as it was then. It's been stable for about 4 months. And you can kind of see, instead of choosing what to encrypt, now it has exclusions. And it goes, I'm not going to encrypt any of the stuff that's necessary for the computer to boot. So I'm not going to encrypt Windows. I'm not going to encrypt program files. I'm not going to encrypt things that are unnecessary that will slow the computer down. I'm also not going to encrypt the ransom message. So you can see helpyourfiles.txt, helpyourfiles.h. Those are the ransom messages telling you how to give them money. So they need to make sure they don't encrypt the ransom message. And then they also make sure, as a safety, to not encrypt any of these extensions that, again, might make the computer not boot. So they won't encrypt any drivers. They won't encrypt any parts of Windows. And they also don't encrypt things like thumbnails, because they want you to be able to see all the photographs that you'll see the little thumbnail of all the pictures you can't access. And that might be an emotional attachment that you'll respond to pay the ransom. It's not just a Windows problem. This was an example of an Android ransomware that we see that was targeting the United States. We've seen lots of variations on Android, and like I mentioned at the beginning, the first ransomware we saw for Android targeted Russians, and they kind of refined their process for how to write the ransomware, so it was very difficult to get rid of, very hard to clean off of the phone, that type of thing. And then once they sort of figured out a good way of doing it, then they started going global and targeting people around the world with Android devices. I particularly like this one because if you look at this screenshot right here, there's a picture of Obama, President Obama, pointing at you like you've done something wrong. And it's very interesting social engineering. But you can see over here they're recommending the victims go to 7-Eleven to buy a prepaid cash card to pay the ransom money. And in each country that'll change, right? So in Europe you'll see it using a PaySafe card or Ucash that you can buy at convenience stores here in Europe, whereas in America you buy MoneyPack. But it's smart enough to recognize who have I infected, present the message in the right language for the ransom, and then direct them to shops where they live, where they can go buy the cash cards in order to pay that ransom. This is an example ransom note from CryptoWall. Again, this is probably one of the more common ones. I did this research in Vancouver, so it's in English, but these are translated. The last I checked, I think they did about 27 languages that they can display the ransom note in, everything from simplified Chinese and Japanese through all the European languages, largely ignoring Asia. We don't see much of this in Asia Pac, maybe a money issue. They can't get as much ransom in India as they can, for example, here in Europe. But they basically explain what encryption is. They refer you to Wikipedia if you need to read up on RSA encryption and the fact that it's not breakable. I actually saw one that referenced the Ed Snowden leaks, saying if the NSA can't break this encryption, you're doomed. You must pay if you want your files back. And of course, now I believe you that you're bad. What do I need to do to pay the ransom? They explain how to buy bitcoins in order to pay that ransom. We see lots of variations on this. The CryptoWall guys have a tendency to be less scary. Some of them are more intimidating. In the past, we've seen they have a countdown timer. If you don't do it in the next 24 hours, your files will be destroyed. Things like that to socially intimidate you into feeling that you need to buy it now in order to protect your environment. There's a ton of money in this. The first modern crypto ransomware we saw was called Cryptolocker. It came out in September of 2013, so 2.5 years ago. And initially, the crooks weren't very good about their operational security. They were putting all the bitcoins from the victims into one Bitcoin wallet. And of course, the Bitcoin blockchain is public. So I was watching every day how much money they were getting from the victims. So this screenshot here is from October 30th, 2013. This was 6 weeks into this malware existing. And 6 weeks in, they had collected 31,734 bitcoins from their victims, which on that particular day was worth $17,700,000 US dollars. So they collected a little over, almost 18 million US dollars in 6 weeks for one criminal group doing this. And this was the very beginning of it. They're much better at it now than they were in 2013 when they first started this. So that just gives you an idea why we're facing such an uphill battle, right? Every vendor here talking to you today, we're all fighting this battle. All of us that sponsor the event, all of us that produce security products here, we're all trying to protect you the best we know how, and yet we hear from you every day that you're still, you know, falling between the cracks sometimes. You're still getting infected with this stuff. But it's not that, you know, when you understand the economics, it helps put it into perspective. These guys, with that kind of money, can hire really clever hackers with poor ethics to help them. They can buy the latest Flash exploits that you haven't had a chance to patch against yet. They can hire professional translators to write those emails to trick your users into opening those attachments. This is not a big deal when you're talking about tens of millions of dollars a month in revenue. And they also have to protect that business like any good organized crime racket, right? Once you have a run rate of $20 million a month, you're not going to walk away from that kind of money. You're going to do what you have to protect it and make sure that you continually bypass the security filters. This is another variation of ransomware we've seen. It's less common now than it was a couple years ago, but call these screen lockers or police locker ransomwares. They pretend to be the local police authorities. You can see here about 30 different countries that they know how to impersonate depending which country you're a victim in. I found one that we had here from Greece that I put on the right side of the screen. This is the idea that, oh, you've committed some sort of copyright policy, you know, you've downloaded a movie illegally or you've been viewing illegal pornography, and so we've locked your computer and you need to pay a fine to the police of 100 euros in order to unlock your computer. And again, you can see in this case, they're telling you here in Greece that you need to buy a UCash or a PaySafe card in order to pay the police fine. These weren't nearly as effective as the crypto ransomware because these didn't actually harm your computer much, right? You could actually download antivirus cleanup tools and remove these from your computer without paying the ransom. But by my estimates and talking to some victims and some research we had done, it's upwards of about 5 to 10% of users would pay the ransom, whereas in ransomware with the crypto stuff, we're seeing upwards of 25% pay the ransom. And of course, the ransom is much higher in the crypto ransomware, where it's $500 instead of $100 or euros. Strangely, you can usually pay the fine in either euros or dollars, so I recommend paying it in dollars because it's a lot cheaper. So to wrap up, what are we going to do? You know, what do we do about this, right? Because there is, like many problems in life, there's no simple answer. There's no silver bullet. And three things are, to me, the most effective things that are working in my experience. And we're going to talk more about these in the workshop if you can join us later. But first off, I mean, education. It won't eliminate the problem, right? You will never alert all of your users to be smart enough to not make mistakes because we're human and we'll always make mistakes. But by having that conversation, especially if it happens to one person, right? George in the office opens the attachment and his computer gets infected and it was pretended to be from Hellenic Post. Well, let the company know. Maybe don't let them know it was George. Don't embarrass George. It's not his fault. But let everyone know about that and that it's okay that that happened, but why do they need to be careful? You know, raise awareness. This is real. It's not just targeting giant companies and military and this kind of thing. It's happening to all of us, right? So everybody needs to be careful. Raising that awareness hopefully will reduce the number of potential incidents that happen in your organization. For the document stuff, so Locky, the newest one, largely comes in through Word documents that have macros. And one of the more effective ways of dealing with that is using a sandboxing technology in your email. So I really encourage you, if your product supports that or if you don't have something like that, you may want to look at it. We're seeing more and more document attacks in general. At Sophos, we did some research last year called the Microsoft Word Intruder, or Malicious Word Intruder, MWI, that's all about how targeted attacks have been favoring Word vulnerabilities and targeting people with malicious Office documents for a couple years now. And now it's gone mainstream with CryptoWare also doing this. So sandboxing can really help explode those attachments safely before they come in, so you don't have to worry about restricting Office documents coming into the network, but you can still safely open them. And lastly, I have a picture here of an endpoint talking to a firewall. A lot of this is about metadata and things talking and working together. Sometimes it's very difficult to just look at a file and know if it's good or bad, the actual malware. But when you combine the origin of the file, that it came in, say, as an email attachment, with the thing that it's also talking to this server out on the internet. When you can combine the network and the file together in that context, or metadata, which I didn't understand the Greek, but the Cisco gentleman before me, I think, was talking a lot about that metadata as well. I saw that he was talking about net flow being sort of like the telephone call log of the network. And that's exactly what we're talking about as well. That metadata is really important for making security decisions. So as much as possible, correlating information from your networking tools and your network defenses with what your endpoint tools and your endpoint defenses have can help put those two pieces together and give a much clearer picture as to whether that document or that website is in fact malicious. So with that, I thank you very much for your time. I hope you found that helpful and educational. And if there's any questions at all, I'll be with the NSS team over here downstairs, and we'd be happy to answer any questions or talk with you. Thank you.